Hey, Spire family. My name is Ashley Weiss. I serve on staff at Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky, and it is my honor to be your host for Spirecast today. We all know that ministry is challenging, especially in a post-pandemic world, and trying to stay healthy and resilient as a church leader is even more challenging. And that's why we've created Spirecast. If you don't know this already, Spirecast is just an opportunity that we have twice a month to bring you an opportunity to hear from a leading expert and really give you the chance to continue to grow your ministry leader muscles, and also just to kind of address difficult or upcoming challenges in the ministry world. And so we really want here at Spire, just have a desire for you to lead from a place of health and wholeness. And so Spirecast is all about helping you do that. And today we are actually going to be talking about such an important topic, especially in this season of the church, indications that your staff needs support, and just kind of walking alongside how do we create healthy staff in a season that truly is not only a great resignation all over our country, but a great resignation within the church. How do we have healthy staff that's raised up and ready to really step into the ministry work that God has called us to. Today, we are actually going to have with us, if you didn't see already, Dr. Charity Byers. Dr. Charity Byers is the CEO and Chief Psychologist of Blessing Ranch Ministries, an incredible ministry in the Florida area, and is a co-author of the book Unhindered, Align the Story of Your Heart. Charity has a PhD in counseling psychology and primarily cares for Christian leaders through 1 week intensive experiences at Blessing Ranch Ministries in Tampa, Florida. And so, Charity, we just want to go ahead and welcome you here today. Hey, Charity, it's so good to see you. So glad that you can be here. I know that briefly we got to talk right before this, but, it is such a huge topic that we're discussing today. I mean, I don't even know sometimes where to start with this conversation in the church, but I'm so glad that we get to learn from you and just from your wealth of experience. I would love for you to just go ahead and dive in. We're going to kind of first talk about some high level conversations around this, and then we'll dive into some specific questions that we've had some staff members from various churches all over the country, all over the world, kind of message in and ask. I think all of us have a personal story, a personal question around this topic, but there's also just some things we need to hit on from a more overview level. And so one of the things that I would love for you to just first hit on is, what are a few clues we can look for that staff isn't doing well, that we need to just have eyes for as ministry leaders?
Well, I think first of all, this is just such an important role that we all take on and play for each other, especially if you're in higher levels of leadership, that you just have your eyes on the people around you. So I'll just share a few thoughts with you, just about some common clues that you might look for. And some of them are going to probably be really obvious, and maybe a couple of them a bit more counterintuitive. But the first thing that I want to talk about is just watching for somebody around you who is either over responding or under responding.
That's good.
I'm talking about something happens. There's an event, there's a moment, there's a circumstance, and what you see come out of them is either very underwhelming according to the circumstances, or it's very overwhelming according to the circumstances. And so, you see certainly those people who blow up and explode, and it's pretty obvious that something's going on inside of them. Something bigger is happening at the heart level. Yeah. But the people who also just go numb, they shut down, they withdraw, they don't have an expected feeling towards something. They're not upset about that when you think they should be. Those are also really good clues that something is going on at the heart level that you might want to dig into just a little bit more. So again, looking for somebody who is over responding to the circumstances, meaning that doesn't match what you're seeing in the moment. Mm-hmm. Under responding, they're not showing up, they're not emoting or expressing the way that you would expect. So that would just be clue number one.
That's really good. I think for over responding, we often lean towards that way of thinking, right, okay, that person's not doing well.
Right.
Don't often have even sometimes the emotional intelligence to really lean in and say, why didn't that person speak up? Why did they seem to disengage? And such good insight into making sure that we balance both of those tensions well and are thinking through that in the room. Can you share more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that we have to be paying attention to, especially after the last couple of years that everyone has lived through, is the accumulation effect. And we need to be able to have the eyes to see the bigger story in somebody's life, meaning we don't just want to gauge how well they're doing by just what's in front of them today. We want to understand how that might be accumulating on top of everything else that they've been going through. So I think we should just assume basically that every ministry leader is somewhat exhausted and that their baseline is to be just a bit stretched on a pretty normal basis. So when they encounter something hard, let's say they had a loss in their family, or even after all these decades, their parents are getting divorced, or there's a diagnosis that's come, something that of course we're already going to believe is going to be a hard thing. We just need to have the eyes to see that isn't just one hard thing. That's one hard thing on top of a heart that may already be stretched and exhausted and pressed in multiple other ways. And so we want to gauge our assessment of how that's going to impact them and how well they're doing by this big picture view of that is accumulating. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard it. We're actually right now in a rest series at our church, and one of the things that we've been talking about is it's different now to do a series on rest post pandemic because we're really still in it, but it's hard to have that conversation when there's already just a fatigue that's generally there, and then you're asking people to now take another step, having kind of these rhythms of rest when you're also needing to address this, what some people kind of call like the Groundhog Day, just endless loop of fatigue that, we think we're over, we think COVID has kind of died down and then Omicron hits, we think that we've kind of figured out the control and then something else happens. And so it's just, there's so many layers to it. And I do think even it requires an extra level of grace when it comes to those that we minister with. I'm interested to know for you, what does that specifically look like within your own ministry, within Blessing Ranch Ministries?
Just the accumulation effect?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've just watched some of our own team members, and many of them with on our particular team have part-time roles. So they're leading ministries in other areas and they're doing other things. And so as we've also been in a season of creating over the last couple of years, which we all know what that's like and how taxing that can be, had to really try to be very gracious with people, recognizing that they're also navigating all these other things going on in the ministry world that have nothing to do with what we're asking them to do, and just trying to keep that big picture view. So I think, we have seen for sure us all kind of show up with a little bit of that extra measure of exhaustion. And I think even on our worst days, a bit more of that hopelessness or jadedness that comes in when you're just like, gosh, can one more thing be hard? So I think we've all tried really hard just to have that extra measure of grace.
Yeah, that's really good. I think it's good for people to even know, I know for me, even to hear from you, this is something you're navigating, not just, at this level as the ministry, the work you do as a ministry, but also literally for those that you're, that are leading in your ministry, it's also an issue. I think that just understanding that it hits at every level, whether you're overseeing a ministry that helps people walk through this or whether you are the ministry itself.
Right.
So I really appreciate that. Would you share just a few more, indicators that you might have for staff?
Well, the next thing that comes to mind for me, this is one that might feel a little bit counterintuitive, but it's to look for the people who might be your highest performing staff members. Really get curious about how well they're doing, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense on the surface, but here's why I say that. Oftentimes, these can be the people who are suffering from something we refer to as the not good enough syndrome. So, why are they working so hard? Why are they putting in 150%? Why are they doing everything that they know is going to make you happy? To prove something. Maybe it's not to you. Maybe it's just to themselves, or maybe it's to God. but they've got some kind of value to earn in their own estimation. And so again, they might be the easiest people for you to lead because they do their job and they do it with 150% effort, but there might be something going on in their heart that's actually more unhealthy. And so you just want to be curious with people like that and say, what is their motivation to do what they do? Is it coming from a healthy or an unhealthy place?
It's really good. It's really good. Yeah, it's convicting to hear. I'm an Enneagram 3, so I hear this. Yes, it is such a thing where what is the motive behind why I do what I do, and I do think in seasons where there are not only resignations, but there are also layoffs. There is a very real, pressure that can happen to, I want to make sure I'm not one of those people. But then at the same time, you're going, is what I'm doing actually for the Lord, or is it for a paycheck in this season? That's a tension to wrestle with. That's really helpful. That's really good. What else would you recommend? Just kind of insights to kind of look into.
Yeah. One other thing I think we just need to keep our eyes on, it kind of got touched on in the very first piece of the conversation where we talked about people either over responding or under responding. And we said, often we don't really pay as much attention to those who might, be under responding. So out of that same line of thinking, I think we just want to be really watching for those people who are falling into the traps of isolation. And it's really easy to miss in the ministry world, because we know how to put on a happy face. Yeah. Like we know how to show up at work and play the part and, be nice to everybody. And so it's easy to miss the person who's truly isolating. So again, look beyond the surface, pay attention to what you see. Is the person just putting on the happy face when they have to in a staff meeting or when they walk in the door in the morning and then shutting their door for the rest of the day? Or do you never get a text from them anymore, like asking how you're doing? Pay attention to the slow creep of isolation that might be going on in somebody's life, because there's often something to that. Maybe it's that they've got a secret that they're hiding and the walls are protective. I don't want to let anybody close because they might find out. Maybe it's a sign of depression. I just don't have the energy for people. I don't have the motivation for people. Or maybe something has happened that has broken their trust with others. And now they're kind of living with that fear of vulnerability. So there could be a lot of reasons why that's happening, but it's a great clue to pay attention to.
That's so good. Today, that's one of the things I had shared was meeting with some staff, and, an indicator for me is always when the door starts shutting more often.
Yeah.
And I love that you said that, like, that is a personal indicator that I keep, kind of at the back of my mind, but I don't often look at that as an indicator for someone else. I know it's one for myself, but sometimes you kind of go, oh, well, they're just getting their work done. They're just making stuff happen. And so it's not always, something I look for myself. I would love to know if you just have some creative ways that, when this kind of starts to happen, that we can get below the surface and really expose what's going on in their heart. And, someone you're seeing, hey, yeah, they're shutting the door. Well, what do you do with that? How do you go and engage that? How do you step into that?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot that we could say around just the practicalities of that. Like, how do you start a conversation with people? How do you love them well through those moments? But I'm going to take this just a little bit of a different direction first. Great. And that is just to give you a little bit of a tool, if you will, to help when you engage that conversation. How do you peel back the layers and try to find out what is it that's really going on in somebody's heart? And so I'm going to give you just 4 seemingly simple questions that can give you a lot of information about somebody's heart. So again, you see the person who's isolating or over responding or something of the sort, and you want to go have a conversation and say, hey, tell me how you're doing. Mm-hmm. So once you get into that conversation with them, here are 4 questions that you can ask them. First of those is ask them this: do you really believe that God is good? Do you really think he's good all the time? Why is that an important question? Well, it's going to reveal to you a whole lot about their heart. Do they really live in the experience of grace, of God's love, of God's goodness? Do they really feel like they're measuring up and good enough in the things that they're doing? Are they suffering from some kind of shame that's preventing them from seeing God as good and good for them and not just for others? There's just so much packed into the way that we see God. And as ministry leaders, we often assume, oh, well, of course I've got that straight. I preach about that, I teach about that, I tell everybody I meet about how wonderful God is. But man, it's so easy for our own image of God to become a little bit skewed as we slip into unhealthy patterns, and for us to make ourselves the exception to that. So it's one thing that really gives you so much information about somebody's well-being. The second question is this: do you believe that you're good? Do you really believe that you are valued and worthy of love? Again, why does that matter? Well, similarly, it's going to show you a lot about the state of their heart. Are they standing in security? Is their identity really rooted in Jesus, or is it gotten caught up in performance and measuring their value by how well things are going?
Yeah.
There's something going on in their life that's bringing shame up and interfering with their ability to receive forgiveness from God. I mean, there's so much that interferes with how we move through life. The third question is this: are other people good? And we all know they're broken, but is there still goodness in humanity? So how are you seeing other people? Like, do you have walls up because your trust has been broken? Can all you see is, your jaded lens of how many people have been critical and left the church? Or do you still have that preservation of seeing people through God's lens? It tells you a lot about how they're going to be engaging with those around them. And the last question would be this: is life good? And is life good even though it's so difficult? And that tells you, again, are they seeing beyond the circumstances of today? Are they caught up in the pressures of all that's in front of you in this moment? Or can you see beyond those circumstances? Can you still see through the lens of hopefulness that comes through our relationship with Jesus? Or maybe are you just, again, overwhelmed by a certain circumstance that you haven't told anybody about? And so these questions are just a gateway into opening up some really rich conversation with people, where you can certainly reveal some maybe circumstances in their life that they haven't been willing to share yet. But it can also work the other way, where you get beyond the circumstances and you really get down into the heart and start dealing with the stuff that's really sending them into a spiral. Because it's not just the fact that maybe something is really hard. Let's say, they reveal to you that their marriage is not going very well right now. We've got a lot of tension and a lot of conflict. Well, that's certainly something that needs to be worked through. But maybe what the real issue that's sending them into a spiral is the fact that that's telling me that I'm not valuable. Like, I'm not loved. I'm not enough. And no matter how hard I try, I can't make my spouse happy. And that's something that their heart is really spiraling in. So there's just such richness to help reveal circumstances in their life, and also to get beyond circumstances and work from the outside in.
And I don't want us to, kind of gloss over these questions without realizing just the simple first step that needs to be taken as ministry leaders is to ask the question. Like, I loved those questions that you have, but I think sometimes we don't even want to go there, sometimes with our staff, because, like, I'll be transparent with kind of where I'm at right now. In this particular season, the workload is heavier. We have had layoffs. We have had to, kind of all take on a little bit more responsibility. And so the workload is heavier. And I am constantly having to live in this tension of, it's important that I know our staff, that we walk alongside of one another, and that they know me. But one of the things is knowing that when I ask the question, I better be ready to give the time to be intentional and actually hearing them, and actually engaging with them. And so I love that your first kind of challenge is to ask questions, because I think that's a challenge in of itself.
That's right, actually.
I want to build that margin to be able to ask some questions. And it really is something that, even just as I'm kind of processing out loud right now, but that I really want to say, okay, am I building margin into my week, overseeing people on our staff, who I can make sure that I have margin to ask questions, make sure I have margin to know how they're doing. And I love the question of, is your life good? Because I think that sometimes there can be, churchy or simple answers with some of the others, but the is life good is also a very deep question. It's a hard question to have.
All very hard if you let yourself go down to the heart level and not the head level.
Yes, every single one of them is such a deep question. And I think that, that is he really good all the time? That is his, is God good? But I love that you took it a little further. And in fact, that's kind of what you did with each one. You asked a question, but then you asked a deeper question there. Hey, let's take this a little deeper. So if they give you the surface level answer or the churchy answer, that first one, let's take it a little bit deeper here. But I think that oftentimes there are just those, we will take that answer, that first kind of level answer, and go, okay, well, that's what they left with. But I think if we're transparent, we all know that they're not answering with full vulnerability. You know what I mean? Yeah. And such an opportunity there. And so I just love those questions. I love that idea. You mentioned, talking about, is God good? Is he really good? Would you talk a little bit about how the gospel intersects with that a little deeper, which part of the gospel they can sometimes make themselves an exception to when it comes to these kind of questions. One of the things that you and I talked about a little bit is what do you believe for everyone but yourself? That's such a great, question to ask. I think that, as ministry leaders, we're often trying to help other people process through, but sometimes we can avoid our own processing. And so can you talk a little bit about that? I don't know if I'm making sense about.
Well, you touch on something very important, and this is something we can certainly self-evaluate about and also be watching for in others around us. But that is, this point where we make ourselves the exception to some part of the gospel. And that would be a reason why we wouldn't be able to say an affirmative yes to any one of those questions, because we've made some kind of exception. And so I think we just need to acknowledge on this topic of well-being and staff that I know, we all believe the gospel. We all believe it as truth and reality, and we will speak it with authority to the person sitting across from us in a room. But because of our own life stories, because of the things that we have experienced and seen that don't always align with the gospel, like somebody hasn't loved us the way that they should, or we've been rejected, or we've been disappointed, or we failed in some major way, we start to make exceptions to that for ourselves. And we refer to this as the two gospel syndrome. So it just simply means we know the gospel, the one gospel, the true gospel, but we apply it to everybody else. And then we've got this second version that just has one or two little sentences changed in it, but it massively changes how it impacts our heart. So, as we're having conversations with others and as we're self-evaluating, we just need to be watching for those moments or asking those questions that help illuminate those places where we made ourselves an exception. Like, are you the one exception to grace? Are you the one exception to having all of the fruit of the Spirit? Or are you the one exception to God really being the defender and protector of? And to just be watching for those things to pop up in conversation and challenging others to really, again, go below the surface. Not just what your head knows and what it can believe, but what does your heart tell you? Because it's the one leading the way usually. And that, again, doesn't just mean you're a feelings person who, lives by what you feel. It just means your heart doesn't have the benefit of logic and faith. And it's leading the way that you experience things, even when your head knows better.
Yes, that's so good. Even are you the one exception when it comes to, I've got to get the work done, but then, but everyone else can rest. And, there is so much there. And one of the things that we often joke about is, a lot of times when you're in a shepherding role, you look at yourself as the shepherd, not as the sheep, but we are the sheep. Jesus is the good shepherd, and we have to model that, especially if we want to kind of go into helping other people experience the good shepherd and the rest and the healing that Jesus wants to bring. And so that's really what we want to do with the remaining time we have here is we just want to dive into some really specific questions that people have around supporting their staff and helping their staff be healthy. So I just want to jump right in. This first question, is a really, really interesting one because we are in a season of collective grief for sure. And this is someone that said, our worship leader's husband died suddenly 7 months ago, and her grief is making it very difficult for her to continue leading worship. We're not sure how to handle it. I think this is such a great question because everybody at some level in this season has experienced grief. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I imagine in this particular scenario, this is something that's being felt among the staff and among the church, because this probably was a loved and very present person. And so I think first thing we need to recognize is we're all going through this together. Mm-hmm. And so I think the grieving process shouldn't just be looked at as how do we support this person through the grieving process, but how do we join together in a grieving process and let that be something that we feel, arm in arm within. And so, on the topic of how do we lead, this person who's having a hard time, getting through this and coming through. So I think the first thing we need to say is that we need to have a ton of grace and a ton of compassion for the depth of that reality. And so we need to be very, very patient with that person, recognizing, the depths of grief that are being navigated, especially when it's an unexpected loss. And so we as a team and as a church, we need to come alongside that person and help impart a process for grieving to take place. And hopefully that can include some professional counseling. And the church does not have to carry every single piece of it. So hopefully that can be a part of it. But together, what can we do? I would hope for there to be spaces where the church could come together first just to acknowledge what was lost, and to acknowledge the meaning that's attached to that for every person. And hopefully collectively as a team, be able to reconcile that loss and all the impacts that it has on us to our faith. And that sounds like a simple thing. Like, we should just sing a worship song about how good God is. Mm-hmm. But I mean, really get into the weeds of the deep and hard questions we end up asking when loss happens. Like, where was God? How did he let that happen? And I think sometimes we're afraid of those questions. We just want to, again, speak the truth over people like, hey, just remember God's good, or remember he had a plan in that. And that is so invalidating to people who are hurting, even though we mean well. And so we just want to be able to take on those really difficult questions and collectively reconcile them to our faith. How are we going to answer that? What response are we going to give to that? And then I think ultimately we need to lead ourselves to a posture of trust as a church. That within our grief, we can grieve, we can, be incredibly sad and feel the absence, but we, marry that with our commitment to trust in the story that we wouldn't have chosen or we wouldn't have written.
Yeah, that's so good. I think hearing, developing a process, but not only that, if this is for whoever wrote this in, if this is a space that you're in where you've never walked this road before, this is a beautiful opportunity, like Charity said, to develop a process so that if it happens again, heaven forbid, but if it does, your church can come around and walk alongside of their staff even quicker than the next time. And I think that sometimes that's the heavy lifting initially is we've never done this. We don't know how to do this. Hey, let's just embrace that. And I love what you're kind of challenging them with, like embrace that, develop a process, walk alongside, welcome that grief, and kind of embrace the messy. Another staff person wrote in, they said, you talked a little bit briefly about this. As a pastor, what's the best thing I can do to support my staff at my church? You mentioned questions and asking those questions, but if you could say, hey, here's one thing beyond that you could do, could you speak to that a little bit?
Gosh, there's so many things that I would love to say to that, but to try to keep it simple, I think we need to make conversations about emotional and spiritual health very common in our culture.
That's so good.
So we need to be talking about it at staff meetings. We need to be making sure this is part of our goal setting on a yearly basis. We need to make this the norm to have emotional and spiritual health at the forefront of our conversations. And if that's true, I think there's so many things that flow from that. Like, how do we set healthy rhythms? Or how do we have a culture where we ask good questions? How do we have a culture that really communicates care in our attitude and not just our actions? those things all flow from having this as a normalized part of our culture.
That's so helpful. And one thing I'll just, briefly close with on that is one of the ways you can build those rhythms is by maybe you just have a standing ministry leader meeting. It's your minister, it's separate from a staff meeting, where you can just go, hey, this is something rising to the surface. And that's one of the ways you can naturally begin to build it into your staff culture. We're sensing people are tired. We need to build in some rhythms, conversation around that. We're sensing people are grieving. We need to build in some conversations around that. But that's so good. I think that's an amazing answer, Charity, just to build that into your staff culture rhythm. We're going to ask one more question and then wrap up our time together. And I'll just say, as ministers, one of the questions that we often have is we have other ministers that maybe will come to us and they need some help. And one person wrote in, my role as a minister in my church is caring for our local nonprofit ministry leaders. What are good practices for me in caring for ministry directors and leaders?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, again, I think the care probably has multiple layers to it. Certainly, there may be, I don't know if it's organizational support and that side of things, but I think what we want to focus on is how you really care for their heart. And so how do you do that well? I think one is just to get into their world and understand from their perspective, what it's really like. So as you engage in conversations, as you, invest in them, making sure that one of the best things you can do for them is help them feel understood. And from there, you give them space to be able to navigate, the challenges for their heart. And so every leader needs a place to do this. And I know I hear from church leaders all the time, I don't know where to do this. I don't have a safe place to do this. And so I would imagine it's somewhat similar here for these nonprofit leaders that you need a place to do that. So be that place where they can have a place to process the things they can't say to their staff members or they can't say to their spouses. And then I think the last thing is that you're there to hold them accountable, just to emotional and spiritual health. And so ask them the good questions like, what do your rhythms look like? And how are you resting? And what are you grieving right now? And, what is the state of your heart? Just asking them those hard things that cause them to be sure that they're in those rhythms, not just of taking a break. We all know a break is needed, but emotional and spiritual health come from investing in our souls. And so you want to guide them towards that and hold them accountable to those things so that they're getting some really good leadership that's promoting their emotional and spiritual health.
That's so good. So, what I've heard kind of today, as we've talked about, is ask good questions. We need to be, as leaders, we need to be asking good questions and asking intentional questions. We need to be creating space to engage with those questions and to engage that conversation that we're having with people. And so building that into our rhythms every week of making sure we're asking good questions, we're being intentional, we're engaging conversations, that we're creating spaces in our ministries, in our organizations to encourage emotional and spiritual health. And then, I loved kind of how you closed, be that place, be that place personally, but I think also be that place for whatever areas you may oversee, whether that's volunteers or whether that is, your ministry, and to hold people accountable to emotional and spiritual health, including ourselves. We need to be held accountable as we're wanting to lead people to places we can't do that if we've not been there ourselves. And so, Charity, I just thank you so much for making time today to share with us. And, our prayer and our hope for you, our Spire family, is that you would live emotionally healthy lives, spiritually healthy lives, but also lead in that way. And so, Charity, we just want to thank you for being here today, and we hope you have a great rest of your week, and especially just pray a blessing over the ministry that God has given you to do as you continue to help people experience emotional and spiritual health. Thanks, Charity.
Thank you, Ashley.